You are not what the world sees. The image you present to others, no matter how refined, friendly, or coherent it may seem, is just a fraction of what resides within you. And as uncomfortable as it may be to admit, it is precisely this image that begins to define how you see yourself. Carl Jung called this construction persona, the mask you wear to function in the world. It is not a lie. It is a necessary psychic creation, a symbolic armor shaped by the demands of social life. The persona protects, organizes, allows for relationships and roles. But it is, above all, a boundary, a layer between what you show and what you hide, between what you have learned to be and what you truly are. The problem arises when this mask becomes the only possible face, when the individual forgets that they are acting and begins to believe that the character is their real self. You work, talk, interact, publish, respond, and gradually, your being starts to mold itself to the expectations of others. Until one day, without realizing it, you begin to feel an emptiness, an unease that has no name, a feeling of being present in the world, but absent from yourself. The persona is the first archetype of our journey, and like any good guardian, it demands something before allowing the crossing: awareness. It protects, but it also limits. The issue is not to destroy it, but to recognize it for what it is: a bridge, not a destination. You need it to navigate the world, but you need to go beyond it, to inhabit your own soul. Think carefully. How many times do you say what others expect to hear? How many times do you smile out of obligation? How many times do you act out of fear of rejection or desire for acceptance? This is not weakness. It is the game of the persona, a game we all play, but few have the courage to interrupt. Jung warned, the more a person identifies with their persona, the further they distance themselves from their self. The persona is a contract with the collective, but the self is the call of the individual, of wholeness, of what pulses within you, even when everything is silent. That is why this video is not about masks, but about crossings. You will be introduced to 7 fundamental archetypes, living images that arise in dreams, myths, symbols, and more importantly, in your own life experience. These figures are not outside of you. They live within your psyche, waiting for the right moment to emerge, not as threats, but as guides. And the first step is this: to realize that there is a mask, and that behind it, there is someone waiting to be seen. The journey to discover the true self does not begin with grand answers. It begins with the simple, yet radical, willingness to look at oneself, without masks, without filters, without fear. So, if you have made it this far, it is because something in you has already begun to move. The question now is, are you ready to cross the door? Inside you, there is someone you have tried to silence, hide, control, or even eliminate, but they have never left. They remain there, waiting, observing, manifesting in the most unexpected moments. This someone is your shadow. The shadow, in Carl Jung's thinking, is not an internal enemy. It is a legitimate part of the psyche. An archetypal figure that carries everything you have, excluded from your conscious identity. Fears, impulses, repressed desires, but also forgotten gifts, cursed truths, dormant strengths. Everything you cannot accept as yours, everything you consider incompatible with the persona you have built, is pushed into this dark region of the soul. Have you noticed how certain reactions escape your control? How sometimes you explode with anger over something seemingly trivial, feel jealousy without wanting to, or sabotage moments of achievement and peace? These are traits of the shadow trying to emerge. It does not manifest only as destruction. It also appears in the creative impulses you fear, in the sexuality you repress, in the courage you do not believe you possess. Symbolically, the shadow is the exiled brother, the guardian of the gate to the underworld, the wolf at the edge of the village. In dreams, it may appear as a threatening figure, a stranger, a monster, a rival. But in truth, it wants to communicate. It wants to be recognized, not fought. Because only by facing it head-on can you become whole. Jung said, "Those who look outside dream. Those who look inside awaken." The shadow is the beginning of that awakening. Not because it is comfortable, but because it is inevitable. True psychological maturity does not come from accumulating knowledge, but from having the courage to face what lies behind the facade and bringing light to the darkness. However, caution is needed. Facing the shadow does not mean yielding to it. It also does not mean controlling it by willpower. It means recognizing it, dialoguing with it, understanding what it wants to express. Often, what the shadow desires is to reclaim what has been left behind: spontaneity, truth, instinct, creativity. Integrating the shadow is freeing yourself from the superficial moral game of good and evil, right and wrong, and entering the deep territory of being human. And why does this matter? Because as long as the shadow remains in the dark, it will control your life. Silently, it shapes your relationships, your choices, your worldview. But when you bring it to light, with awareness, with compassion, with firmness, it ceases to be a saboteur and becomes an ally. And thus, by traversing this inner territory and making peace with what has been forgotten, a new psychic landscape opens up. You begin to realize that within you exist opposing forces, and that they need to dialogue, not wage war. And it is precisely at this point in the journey that two fundamental figures emerge. Two internal images that profoundly shape your way of loving, creating, thinking, and relating: Anima and Animus. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Inside every human being, there resides a mysterious presence, a figure that does not belong to the external world, yet cannot be ignored. Jung referred to it as anima when it appears in the male psyche, and as animus when it manifests in the female psyche. These archetypes are not merely representations of the opposite sex. They are bridges. Bridges between the conscious and the unconscious, between the ego and the self. They are vivid images that act as mediators of the soul. The anima is the personification of the inner feminine in man. She is not simply the sensitivity or emotion of the modern man. She symbolizes his ability to connect with the unconscious, with feelings, with intuitive values. She appears in dreams as mysterious, seductive, wise, or dangerous feminine figures. She can be the muse that inspires, the inner mother that nurtures, the witch that destabilizes, or the goddess that reveals hidden paths. Each facet of the anima is a stage towards psychic wholeness. The animus, on the other hand, is the archetype of the inner masculine in women. It symbolizes reason, direction, the structure of thought, and the energy that drives action. When unconscious, the animus can manifest as a critical internal voice, judgmental and rigid. But when integrated, it becomes a reliable guide, a force of authentic expression, a creative spirit that helps a woman assert her individuality. In dreams, the animus may appear as multiple masculine figures: the warrior, the teacher, the lover, the wise man. These images are not static. They evolve as our own psychological development progresses. Denying or repressing them creates imbalance, as it distances us from the completeness that the psyche seeks. A man who rejects his anima tends to project it onto the women he encounters, and lives in relationships filled with idealizations, deficiencies, or repulsions. A woman who rejects her animus often struggles to assert her voice or becomes dominated by a hostile rationality disconnected from her inner truth. But when these figures are recognized as living parts of our inner world, something changes profoundly. The relationship with the other ceases to be a territory of projection and becomes a field of discovery. Love stops being an escape from loneliness and becomes a true encounter between wholes. Creation, inspiration, structured thought, and emotional surrender. All of this begins to flow with more harmony. Integrating anima and animus is, therefore, to accept that we are made of polarities, that the feminine and the masculine are not merely social or biological roles, but cosmic principles that intertwine in the soul of each of us. It is to allow intuition to walk alongside reason, for sensitivity to complement strength, for surrender to coexist with assertion. Jung saw this internal meeting as a crucial milestone in the process of individuation. Because when we manage to dialogue with these archetypal figures, without fear, without submission, without projections, we begin to see the other with greater clarity. We start to inhabit our own psyche with more wholeness. But like any symbolic process, this reconnection with the soul requires traversing the unknown. It is not merely a movement of acceptance, but also of transformation. And it is at this point in the journey that one of humanity's oldest and most universal figures reveals itself: the hero. Within every human soul lies a force that refuses to be diminished, an indomitable will that is not satisfied with the comfort of the surface. It is this force that drives us to go beyond the known, to confront limits, to descend into the very abyss in search of something we do not always know how to name. Jung recognized this energy as the archetype of the hero, and its presence marks a turning point in the journey of individuation. The hero represents the internal drive for overcoming, for facing chaos, for confronting oneself. He is the nascent consciousness that refuses to live imprisoned by the automatic. It is the part of us that, in the face of pain or disorder, does not flee. On the contrary, it advances. In myths, the hero faces monsters, crosses deserts, loses everything only to then discover his true power. These images are not mere allegories. They are symbolic portraits of a deep psychic process. The dragon that the hero faces represents the unintegrated unconscious forces, fears, traumas, repressed desires. The desert represents existential emptiness, the silence after the deconstruction of the persona and the confrontation with the shadow. Loss, fall, humiliation are stages in the dissolution of the inflated ego, prerequisites for the birth of a new consciousness. But the hero is not driven by pride. He is driven by necessity. Something calls him, and this call cannot be ignored. It may come as a crisis, an illness, a rupture, a persistent dream, a deep feeling that life as it is cannot continue. The call is always symbolic and always radical. Something in you needs to die for the essential to be born. This process of confrontation requires courage, yes, but not the superficial courage of those who consider themselves invincible. The courage of the hero is that of one who recognizes their own fear and, nonetheless, proceeds. He knows that the path is not safe, that the territory is dark, that there will be losses, but he also knows, instinctively, that the only real alternative is to continue sleeping. And he refuses to do so. In symbolic terms, the hero is the mediator between the ego and the self. He represents the movement of consciousness that turns inward, confronts the unconscious powers, undergoes trials, and returns transformed. It is no coincidence that, in many cultures, the hero dies before being reborn. This symbolic death is inevitable, because the old ego must crumble for a new inner structure to emerge, broader, truer, more connected to the center. But the hero does not walk alone. He needs symbols, guidance, psychic nourishment, and this is where one of the deepest and most ambiguous presences of the unconscious comes in: the Great Mother. Before time, before name, even before consciousness, there was the womb, the undifferentiated totality of existence. The archetype of the Great Mother represents this primordial origin. She is the matrix of the psyche, the symbolic womb from which all things emerge, and to which, inevitably, everything returns. In her luminous dimension, she nurtures, protects, envelops, and generates life. In her dark face, she suffocates, devours, paralyzes. Like all archetypal images, she is ambivalent. And it is precisely this ambivalence that gives her depth. In the journey of individuation, after the confrontation with chaos and the struggle of the hero, the individual is led back to the origin. But this return is not a regression. It is a reintegration. The reunion with the Great Mother symbolizes the recognition of the deepest unconscious forces, the instinct of belonging, the need for acceptance, the search for rooted meaning. She appears in dreams as the earth, the ocean, the cave, the immense woman, the goddess, the ancestor. She is the energy that sustains us and threatens us, that heals us and imprisons us, depending on how we relate to her. Throughout history, diverse cultures have represented this figure with different names: Isis, Gaia, Demeter, Mary, Kali. But all these images share the same symbolic essence: the principle of fertility, protection, death, and rebirth. Contact with the inner Great Mother confronts us with the fundamental paradox of life. Only those who accept dying can be reborn. And at this point in the journey, something dissolves. The heroic ego, which until then fought for itself, finds itself before the force that transcends the self. The individual bows before the cosmic. And then, in the silence of this encounter, something new is born. This new does not come from force, nor from control, nor from will. It comes as a breath, a fragile glow, a spark. This new is the divine child. The divine child is one of the richest and most enigmatic archetypes of the collective unconscious. It symbolizes latent potential, becoming the center that has not yet fully realized itself. It is the possibility of regeneration, the sacred future inscribed within the present. In dreams, it appears as a radiant baby, a wise child, an innocent figure, yet endowed with hidden power. It is not just a symbol of literal childhood, but of the psychic capacity to renew, to start over, to be born from oneself after traversing the inner desert. Jung saw in the divine child a direct representation of the self, not the self as an achieved totality, but as a promise, as an archetypal guidance that leads the psyche toward integration. When this child appears, it does not come as a rational answer. It comes as presence, as a living symbol of what is still possible, even after chaos. It is the healing that does not explain, but transforms. It is the center that resurfaces at the exact moment when everything seemed lost. But, like everything in the symbolic universe, the child also needs to be recognized and cared for. It is not about idolizing it or protecting it in an infantilized way. It is about honoring its meaning, understanding that it represents the psychic future, the most authentic and vulnerable part of being, and that, without it, the journey of individuation stagnates. Without it, the cycle does not complete. By uniting the energy of the Great Mother with the presence of the divine child, something essential happens. The being returns to its origin, not as escape, but as transformation. The psyche reorganizes, consciousness expands, And it is at this point, in this fertile field where death and birth intertwine, that the most central figure of all of Jung's psychology begins to emerge: the self. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebook, Beyond the Shadow. It breaks down Jung's core ideas and gives you tools to understand yourself more deeply. Link is in the pinned comment. Everything you have experienced so far, the masks you had to wear, the shadows you faced, the opposites you reconciled, the battles you fought, and the rebirths you underwent, all of this pointed to a center. Not a fixed point in space, but an internal, deep, silent, and living presence. Carl Jung called this center the self, and it is here that the archetypal journey finds its symbolic apex. The self is not the inflated ego, much less an idealized image of who you would like to be. It is, in Jungian terms, the archetype of psychic wholeness. It represents the union of opposites, conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine, light and shadow, reason and instinct. It is what you have always been, but have not yet become. The self is the timeless essence of being, the organizing core that guides the process of individuation from the beginning. While the ego operates in the external world, seeking control, identity, and security, the self acts as an inner compass, guiding the psyche toward integration. It manifests in symbols, myths, dreams, never directly, as its nature transcends rational language. In dreams, it may appear as a divine figure, an old wise man, a golden child, a mandala, a sacred animal, a luminous center. These are images charged with numinosity, which do not explain, but transform. It is important to understand that the self is not a moral or psychological ideal. It is not an improved version of yourself. It is an experience, an intimate experience of unity, in which all the conflicting parts of the psyche harmonize in a broader field. Integrating the self means becoming whole, not perfect, and for that, one must truly accept who they are, with all their imperfections, contradictions, and scars. The encounter with the self, however, is not a destination achievable by willpower. It is an archetypal gift that only reveals itself when the individual is ready. And this preparation is not linear. It requires destruction and reconstruction. It demands loss, silence, surrender. Because the self can only emerge when the ego yields, not as submission, but as conscious surrender to the greater wholeness that inhabits us. This moment of surrender is often accompanied by powerful symbols: the circle, the center, the cross, the temple, the light at the end of the cave, the alchemical union of opposites. All point to the same reality, the existence of a deep and living order that sustains the psyche. An order that does not come from outside, but from within, and that, when recognized, heals, not in the sense of eliminating suffering, but in the sense of giving it a place, a meaning, a function. Jung dedicated his entire work to understanding this process, and he always returned to the same point. The goal of life is not to be happy, but to become who you are. This means accepting the totality of being and allowing the self, as the organizing center of the soul, to guide us with its silent wisdom. The symbolic journey you have undertaken here is, in fact, a return to yourself. Jung did not promise simple solutions. He knew that diving into the collective unconscious is like descending to the bottom of a dark lake. There are risks, there are resistances, there are parts that will try to pull you back to the surface. But there are also treasures. And these treasures are not things you can carry in your pockets. They are subtle, silent, profound transformations. They are different gestures, broader perceptions, more authentic decisions. Most people live an entire life orbiting around a manufactured identity, a functional yet empty persona. And many only realize this when it is too late. When the body falls ill, when relationships collapse, when the soul disconnects from its own meaning, you now hold a symbolic map in your hands, and with it comes a responsibility, not to let yourself fall asleep again. These images were not invented, they were discovered. They are in the oldest myths of humanity. They are in tales, in dreams, in visions. They are within you, and perhaps now you will begin to notice them more clearly, in the way you react, in what you project onto others, in the patterns that repeat, in the emotions that arise from nowhere. Every gesture can be a symbolic message, every crisis, an invitation to integration. If something touched you in this video, if any image resonated, if any passage echoed something you have lived or are living now, share it in the comments. Which of these archetypes do you feel is most active in your life today? Which one do you have difficulty recognizing or integrating? This space here is also a symbolic field, a place of exchange, of expression, of meeting with the other. And don't forget, the next video is also part of this journey. It is important, because the symbolic process is continuous. Each new image, each new symbol, each new reflection expands your consciousness and brings you even closer to your truest essence. Keep walking, keep observing, keep listening to yourself. The inner journey is just beginning.